There is an expression that is not from places where I grew up, but I love it because it's very descriptive. I would guess most of you have heard it. All hat and no cattle, right? All hat and no cattle, right? Is somebody who's talking big but doesn't have any real actual experience in what they're talking about. So I think it's a great reference for our text for today, a challenge for us as Christians to understand this idea that we are called to act. Now, it's always a good thing as Lutheran Christians to take a moment and pay attention closely when there is a reading from the book of James. Luther hated this book, just hated it. If it was up to him, it would have been chucked from the New Testament. He referred to it as an epistle of straw, meaning it was not something of substance spiritually. That's kind of code Lutheran language for it being a lot about works and less perhaps about grace. And as Lutherans, historically, we tend to chuck readings that are about works and focus on grace, but every once in a while, it's good for other corners of the Christian tradition to poke us a bit and say, hey, let's talk about works a little bit. In fact, when we think of those kind of pokes, we think of something a few years ago. You used to see a lot of these. You would see at youth gatherings and other things, these bracelets. They would have these initials on it, right? It would say WWJD. What would Jesus do? Exactly. Notice they didn't say, what would Jesus say? What would Jesus think about this? It would say, what would Jesus do? The doing of the faith. And that's usually what kind of makes Lutherans break out in a hive and stress out because we're not earning points with God, but it's what we're called to be about. As Christians, it's simply what we do. What we do. Now, in strong Lutheran tradition, we do have this idea of doing. If we think of the Augsburg Confession, and we think of what defines the church, you have to see what a group of people is in fact doing. The church is the place where the gospel is preached and the sacraments are administered rightly. You can't just look at the sign out front. You have to see what, in fact, the church is doing to be able to identify it as church. There's another part of this puzzle that I think is important as well, is to get a good reminder of how we understand ourselves in this world. In classic Christian language, we might talk about sin or we might talk about evil. And in our modern times, I sometimes find that language to be less helpful because none of us wants to think of ourselves as sinful. None of us wants to think about ourselves as being evil. We're generally okay thinking about our neighbor as being sinful or evil, but not so much about us, right? And it pushes us in a direction where it's easy to think of others as other. The ones who are causing the problems. Not me, I'm not causing problems, but again, my neighbor, right? This sense that we're better than them. If we remember that we too are broken, it allows us to see our neighbors as ourselves, as being in the same boat. People who are broken as we are broken. Now, that doesn't always make things easier, but it helps us to learn how we might navigate this world where there are so many voices that are pointing to the other as less than human, unworthy of love, perhaps deserving of punishment. There are all kinds of ways in which this world screams out in ways that would be less, what would Jesus do? And more maybe what James would do, but that's a separate piece. I remember when I was in seminary, we were talking about how we change our behavior in different ways. And it seems like there's kind of two basic tracks on this. There's a track where we, read a book, have an important conversation, read an article, and we decide, oh, I have some new piece of knowledge, and I am now going to live differently in this regard in my life, and I have found this new, better path to walk. That happens sometimes. Sometimes that's the case. One of the other ways that I have found to be more true, perhaps at times, is that we act differently, and our heart and our mind eventually follow. But it's maybe not where our heart and mind is initially. Maybe it takes time. In our COVID world, maybe we say our heart and mind is a lagging indicator, right? This idea that we act in ways that are more like Christ would act, and that the consequence of that is that our hearts draw closer to Christ. Now, what is Christ about? In the text that we have for today, we hear about orphans and widows. We hear about Christ acting in a world that seems to be pushing back. Now, I have to say, I think it's an important disclaimer about the gospel text that Jesus is not telling us not to wash hands. I think there are people here that would argue that washing hands are a good thing. So we should keep on that. But as we think about what Jesus is about, he was about loving people that others saw as unlovable or unworthy of love. So let's think of the Gospels. Who is Jesus hanging out with? He is hanging out with the homeless. He is hanging out with women. He's hanging out with prostitutes. He's hanging out with all kinds of people that are making the religious establishment upset and angry. Now, here's the thing. There's still religious establishment today. They didn't go away just because Jesus came. They're still here. We're still here. Again, brokenness. We were talking about that, right? This sense of those who were against Jesus primarily were the leadership within his religious tradition. So what does that teach us today about what it means to act in ways that are closer to how Christ would have us act? It means that we express a love towards those for whom the upright perhaps tell us should not be loved because they are unworthy of love, because they are worthy of punishment, whatever the case might be. But Christ says they are worthy of love. Maybe that's not easy, because maybe deep inside of us, this brokenness that is our human condition kind of rises up and says, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be near to these people. I don't want to love them. I don't want to be about that. And this is where I think this idea that as we act in love towards others, that over time our heart and mind begin to follow. So this idea of what would Jesus do? Well, first today, he'd probably be a big fan of hand washing. Secondly, Christ is calling us to reach out and to love those who are most hurting, who have been pushed to the fringes, the ones who have been lost, the ones who often are persecuted. Those are the ones we are called to love. And in living lives about action, about love towards others, our hearts and our minds are brought closer to Christ. Amen.